Good morning, dearest friends. It is Wednesday, the 6th of Adar Beis, March 9th. We are here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. And presently we're studying Masechas Shabbos. And today, for the first time, from the beginning of the session, we can say we are in chapter 14. Perek Shmoneh Shratzim. Shmoneh Shratzim is certainly an interesting name for a chapter. And if you've ever studied the commentaries or an analysis and you'll see a reference to Shmoneh Shratzim, you'll wonder, what's that about? That's a funny name for a chapter. And of course, that's what we're going to start our discussion with. Of course, we dedicate our learning for the well-being of the dear members of the Chabura, those in the front of the camera, behind the camera, and the families of our dear scholars. Of course, I want to mention Leah Basrita, Malka Basrivka, and I also want to mention that we're going to learn Le'iloi Nishmas, Ita Bastovi,
I'll do it.
and in prayerful wishes for an abundance of good news for Klal Yisrael. The world needs it, we need it, and for a moment, let's jump into the Gemara. Today, I'm going to need your help. I'm going to preemptively hit mute all with an invitation to unmute, so we could hear your wisdom, your questions, your comments. But at Beryl's, I read Beryl's mind, and so I hit mute all just to start off. We are still, in a sense, in a segment that's talking about trapping and related issues. So we discussed in the previous parak that we are prohibited from trapping critters, animals on Shabbos. But for the most part, the biblical prohibition is when there is a constructive purpose, most obviously for consumption, human consumption. And so trap a deer, have some delicious venison, or I don't know, however you eat your deer. Of course, shechted according to halacha, trapping fish or birds. Talking about wild animals. It's, well, and a grasshopper, right? We talked about chagavim, plausibly also for human consumption, kosher consumers. The OU, to my knowledge, will not give a hechsher on a grasshopper, but anyways, we're now moving along on the same subject to talk about the fate of other kinds of creatures, which are less obviously trapped, but perhaps also of value or use. And so we're going to talk about shratzim. Now, shratzim, the word sheretz is an interesting word. The word sheretz means a crawling creature, a creature that is low to the ground. There is no single scientific word in English for sheretz. Mammals and, right, doctor, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think there's a scientific classification of a specific group of animals called sheretz. The reason why I say that is sheretz is a little bit broad. It could include, how do we call it? Lizards, snakes, rodents, bugs. So there's a whole variety of different creatures that are all included in this category of sheretz. And there's a pasuk in the Torah that enumerates 8 different crawling creatures in the Torah. The truth is, yesterday we started reading it, and today, before we get into the Gemara, I want to just review them and give you some of the potential translations for these different animals. We'll discuss a little more, and then we're going to compare and contrast, or we're going to identify a specific machlokes around the Shmoneh Shratzim, and we're going to discuss if the halachis of purity, tumah and tahara, and Shabbos are identical or not. In order to do that, we're going to compare and contrast a few different texts. We're going to review a few different Tanoim, 2 different sages of the Mishnah, their beliefs and viewpoints on the matter of how to treat certain crawling creatures for purity, for Shabbos. And we're going to survey a few sages of the Talmud who have differing ways of understanding the machlokes. And to get through that, I'll need your assistance. But first, let's share the screen and get started. So, no, I'm sorry, that was the wrong screen, but we'll do this anyways. Hopefully you can still see my screen. Here's the Gemara, Shmoyne Shratzim. And let's actually do this. No, I'm sorry, that's not what I wanted to do. Hold on. This is what I wanted to do. All right, here's the Mishnah again. We read it yesterday at the end of our discussion. Let's do it again. So again, the Torah enumerates 8 different kinds of shiratzim, and the Torah tells us these are impure. Choled, achbar, tzav, anaka, koyach, halata, hachoymet, vantin shamis. It sounds like I'm speaking gibberish.
Is there a difference?
Or Spanish or Chinese? I'm actually speaking Hebrew.
Is there a difference in the definition of a sheretz and a remes?
Again, a sheretz and a
Remes. Resh mem shin.
Remes, you are correct. Remes means a crawling creature.
Right. So in sheretz also. So excuse me.
Interesting. You're making a very interesting point.
Is it the same? It's just redundant, or is there a difference between the two?
I'm sure there is a nuanced distinction, and let's keep our eyes peeled for a possible distinction, but I don't have something for you in the moment. Do you have a theory you want to present?
No.
I might say that maybe Romes describes an activity that a sheretz does, and the sheretz might be the.
But if you go back to where you were before, the way it was written is shkatzim uremasim.
Where?
Where was it? I just saw it. Here. Ush'ar shkatzim uremasim.
I hear what you're saying. Ushar shkatzim uremasim.
So why?
Well, I'll tell you a theory. Actually, hold on. I don't. You know what?
How does that?
No, I'll tell you what I think. I think that there's sheretz or shekets. First, hold on. There's 3 words here. There's sheretz, shekets, and remetz.
Right.
I think, and I may be off over here. The reason why we use different definitions is because you could use the word sheretz to describe the broader kind of animal, but we might also use sheretz to talk about the specific animals that are enumerated. So shekets and remes, I think, are more descriptive. They are considered in the Torah disgusting, right? Shekets means gross, disgusting, abominable. Remes describes their activity, their crawling. But you are asking, indeed, you're making a very interesting observation, why our Mishnah uses these different Hebrew words, shekets, or sheretz, shekets, remetz. So the word sheretz, I think, is inclusive.
Because I would say, first of all, they are kosher. There's some that are kosher, some are not. So maybe
no, none of these are kosher.
So what are chagavim are considered what?
I'm sorry?
Chagavim are considered what?
Chagavim are not considered as sheretz in this context. So here's I think the answer. Sheretz in this very mission, I think, is more narrowly tailored to the enumerated 8 shratzim. Shekets and remes are talking about other animals that we would plausibly include into this category, but they're not enumerated. And we'll see in the course of the Gemara more discussion about if there's something special about the 8. So this is a good question, a good comment, and let's bear in mind if there are halachically relevant or applicable distinctions here. Because we're going to already get into a number of distinctions and identifying factors. Sheretz literally means an animal that slithers or moves around without its legs being noticeable, which is interesting because many of these animals do have legs, but I guess they're low to the ground. They're not as tall. Proportionally, right? Mammal, and I may be off over here because is an achbar a mammal?
I think so.
I think so. So we need a different way to distinguish. But basically, most larger animals have a. I'm sorry.
Yeah, achbar, a mouse is a mammal. A mammal,
right? So there's I'm lacking my scientific terminology over here but there's a distinction between the length of the legs of of humans, of course, but also different larger creatures that we interact with, and then the size of the legs or non-existence of legs, which is why we're calling them sherets, which really indicates a kind of slithering or crawling kind of way of movement. So here again, the pasuk enumerates.
I didn't touch one.
Choled achvar tzav, anaka koach l'ta, chomet vatin shamas. I want to read from you a sampling before we go into the Gemara from the Art Scroll Gemara. And actually, hold on one sec. Looking to see if Rabbi Steinsaltz in his
Kids
book.
used to call creepy crawlers.
Creepy crawlies, right? Why? Why do we call them that? Because that's what they are. They're creeping, they creep and they crawl.
Closed door.
Also, Rabbi Steinsaltz here also has some, he has some ideas. And we should point out, all the commentaries will point out that if you look in the Chumash, the Mefarshim do not have a consensus on the precise identity of the different critters. And so if you'll go through Rashi, and then you look in other commentaries, you'll notice that there are vast varying perspectives on the animals. So what I want to do now, just for a little bit, not to bore you, I want to get a little bit of a handle on what these animals are. And then as the Gemara discusses them, we might want to consider if we like these definitions or not. So Rabbi Steinsaltz says, the tzav, which is number 3 here, right? So tzav, he says, in modern Hebrew, Dr. Stamler, what is a tzav in modern Hebrew?
It's a turtle.
It's a turtle. So in modern Hebrew, it's a turtle, but the prevailing Talmudic opinions is that is a kind of creature called a dab lizard. Have you ever seen a dab lizard? I have not.
By the way, I see there's a definition in the Aderet Eliyahu.
Where?
What?
There's a definition where?
In the written in the Aderet Eliyahu. I don't know, is that by the Gra? Who wrote Aderet Eliyahu? So it says here, and I'm going to quote the Hebrew, Sheketz ba leorot al davar ma'us. Sheketz is a despicable, connotes a despicable thing. Remes and ba'alei chaim tanim. Remasim are small, small animals, probably without any vertebrae. That crawl. And a sheretz is a collective name for all small animals.
So I think we were mechaven for the most part. So here is, according to Rabbi Steinsaltz, what the tzav is: spiny-tailed lizard, also known as a dab lizard, which scientific name I cannot pronounce. Uromastix, I don't know what that, but anyway, so here we get an idea. Not kosher, but that's not what we're talking about. Now we're talking about the laws of purity and impurity. Moving right along, the chomet, which is over here, he says this would also be another kind of lizard with shorter legs. And then again, the Steinsaltz says lita'a. In modern Hebrew, Dr. Stammer, lita'a means
the lizard.
The generic word for lizard, and then you have specific types.
The chomet is also seen today in Israel, and it's a smaller lizard.
But lita'a, I think, can be generally seen as the general word for lizard.
Absolutely.
But according to Rabbi Steinsaltz, he says this would be a small spotted.
But why is the Leta'ah and the Chomet included together in the same line with the Anaka and the Yanchu? Was it
I'm sorry, you're asking why they're all lizards?
No, they're not all lizards. That's my point. So why are they? If you go back to that line,
So we're not going to be. We can't. I mean, these are good questions, but for the purposes of the Gemara, I want to avoid super
Okay.
diuk in the order. I just want to get a survey of what they are, or at least an idea of what they are, and then we're going to have a different kind of fun in the Gemara. So please conserve your brain cells and stay alert because I'm going to need your help very soon. Now we'll go through this fast. The art scroll here brings and goes through all of them. But Steinsaltz just gives us three of them. Here, the art scroll goes through all of them. He says like this: the choled, according to Rashi, is a weasel, or perhaps a mole, or a rat. Rashi says weasel, Rav Sadia says mole, Rambam says a rat. So as you can see here, we already don't have quite a unanimous agreement on what exactly we're talking about. Achbar, in modern Hebrew, generally means rodent. And the art scroll takes the position that this clearly does mean a rodent as well. Doesn't mean a rat or a mouse. That's somewhat ambiguous. Tzav is described possibly as a toad or a ferret or a kind of lizard. Art scroll, Rav Steinsaltz says a lizard. So here we have a lot of variability, a lot of very vastly different possible creatures. Ferret, lizard, or toad. Anaka, Rashi says in the Chumash, is a hurricane, which would be a modern French word for hedgehog or porcupine. Try. Anyways, according to the Radak, it's a beaver. And so again, Anaka here would be a sheretz, possibly a porcupine, a beaver, very different. And you might be surprised to consider a beaver a creepy crawly rebel. Would you consider, or would you suppose that a beaver is a creepy crawly? I think it's one of the animals that Canada is proud of, and Canada can attribute its part of its.
We have it. We have the beaver on our nickel coin.
Right.
That's the yichus of the beaver.
If not for the beaver, you might not be speaking French in Montreal. All right, koyach, a type of lizard, possibly a chameleon. Lita'ah, lizard. Chomet, possibly a snail or a slug, according to Rashi. Rashi describes that it's a critter that grows within a shell, like a snake. I'm sorry, a snail. The Radak says it's a chameleon. And lastly, tinshames, maybe a mole or a lizard. So there is a lot of different variations on what these exact animals may be. For the purposes of our Gemara, it's not going to be supremely necessary to know the identity of each of them, but it is important to note that their skins are very divergent in nature, use, pliability. You might see some of these animals you may see their skin fashioned into accessories, others certainly not. And to be honest, I'm not certain what you do with a porcupine's hide. Is there a hide that's independent of the bristles? I don't know. And then when you talk about a beaver, well, the beaver's pelts is quite desirable. So suffice it to say, we have a lot of different possible situations. I've never seen a rat skin purse. I don't suppose they're going to sell that. Well, anyways, okay, we'll stop while we're ahead. Now let's take a look at our Gemara. One more introduction. I'm sorry, I know there's a lot of introductions over here. The pasuk about sheretz is talking about ritual impurity. These animals convey tuma as a sheretz does. And when you touch them, bimotam, when they die, their corpses make you impure. So there's a pasuk that talks about ritual impurity. And there's going to be a specific discussion that we're going to quote in a moment that talks about when hide, skin has the identical halachic status as the flesh of a critter, and when the hide, skin, leather does not have the same halachic status as the impure animal. That's one issue. And there's another issue, which is, are you allowed to puncture, hurt, possibly cause a black and blue mark to an animal on Shabbos? Then the question is going to be, to what end is it constructive? So now forget everything we just did, forget everything I said. Let's take a look at the Mishnah. Shemaina Shratzim. The 8 enumerated creeping animals mentioned in the Torah. Well, they're mentioned in the Torah about purity and impurity. But Hatzadan, if you trap one of them, Rashi says, Chayiv, Shebemina Nitzai. These are animals that a person desires to trap. There are animals that people typically trap, and if a person typically traps them, one is Chayiv for trapping it on Shabbos. But not only trapping them, you're Chayiv, but if you injure, if you wound one of these animals, you are Chayiv. Anyone want to give me here a translation or a definition? What does it mean? Hachovel, to harm. Anyone? Unmute yourself if you want to share something. A wound.
If someone makes a injury.
An injury. Are all injuries created equal?
No, all
There's
different.
many different types of wounds. And so the first big issue we're going to have over here is, what type of chovel are we talking about? Are we talking about a cut, a gash, or a black and blue mark? And this question is a big question that will have a lot of halachic implications. Let's see,
The
Rashi.
question also could be if the injury is manifests itself just as a result of the trap, or
That's not, no, that's
or
not.
once it's trapped, then you injure it.
No, I want to clarify now. No, we're not talking, we're not talking about a kind of trap that gives an injury. We're talking about a trap that simply contains the animal. And so we're talking about a person who, for whatever reason, is proactively being chovel. And the question is why. So let's see Rashi.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
why did we have to wait for these creatures? Why didn't we ask the same question when we had to trap the other animals in the house or whatever?
Which question?
Injured, what kind of wound?
Well, let's see. I'll tell you why. Because there's a big distinction between most of the animals that we talked about and the purpose for injuring them. Let's see. I think with time we'll perhaps, it's not a bad question, but let's first see what the Gemara has to say here before. If we don't know what the Gemara says here, we're not going to be able to effectively contrast it with the previous Gemaras. So Rashi says, you know why? If you cause a wound to these animals, you're chayiv, and probably to the exclusion of other creeping, crawling animals. So Rashi says, you know what? The yesh lohen, or these 8 creatures have a kind of hide that has value as leather. Or I shouldn't just say that it has value, but it actually has a thick skin. Kidimifarish beGemara, as the Gemara is going to explain later. V'havyale chabura she'ina chayzeres. This is a kind of wound that does not revert. It remains injured. The havyale tulda the shoichet. And so Rashi gives a first explanation. This is kind of like shoichet. You're harming, you're cutting the skin, you're cutting the hide in a way that's not going to be easily repaired. And so just like to be shochet, you're cutting the animal in a way that's going to take its life. Well, here, you've done a partial shochet. You've cut the skin, you've caused blood to emerge, and this is like shochet, and therefore you're not allowed to harm these animals, because just like a kosher animal that gets shchita, the shchita punctures and rips through skin that is not just skin, but or a kind of hide, a strong hide. Therefore, you're not allowed to do it. It's just like shochet.
Rabbi.
Hold on. Mishnah Chrina. Alternatively, 1 second. Kivan the yeshlem are being that they have a kind of hide Nitzba ha'or b'dam ha'nitzar bo. When you hurt an animal, even without cutting it, you cause the hide to become pigmented with a black and blue mark. D'chayev mishum tzoveya, and now this might be a variation of tzoveya, of dying. Hold on, Eli, go ahead. Then we'll ask.
So I think what's saying over here is, I think we're making two sins. One is trapping and one is injuring. Is that what we're saying over here?
Yes, the Mishnah gives two different prohibited actions.
Okay.
You're not allowed to trap an animal. Now, suppose the animal's already in your custody, so you're not trapping it, but you're still not allowed to harm it. And Dr. Hammer, we should point out that to pointlessly and aimlessly harm an animal is always prohibited. Here, the assumption is that somehow there is something constructive about what's happening over here. And yet, on Shabbos, it's prohibited. Rashi gives us two theories here. Either cutting the hide is like a little bit like shechting, and that's prohibited, or by harming the animal, you're causing blood to pool on the skin, and you're causing it to be have pigment. Now, according to this assertion of the second opinion of Rashi, most likely you'd only be chayiv if you actually did it with the desire of dyeing or putting pigment on the hide, which again it's shocking. I would not expect this to be how you intend to put pigment on an animal. And again, we're certainly alarmed by the Tsar Bali Chaim aspect, but let's take it as it comes. Now, Mark and I last night briefly surveyed the Shulchan Aruch by Yeshiva night on these subjects, and there's a discussion about how an animal that has thinner skin, it might not have long-term dyeing because it's very thin or something to that effect, and it might not become discolored, or you would never intend to preserve that hide. So even if it did become colored, there's nothing constructive about it. But these animals, where there is a strong desire to have their hide, well, then ostensibly what's being done here is an attempt to do something to the skin. So again, just to recap, I know we're going a lot into the weeds here. Mishnah makes a simple assertion. If we could identify the 8 shuratzim in the Torah, these 8 shuratzim are not allowed to be caught, obviously. Well, I'm sorry, I take that back. They're not allowed to be trapped because people want to trap them, and you're also not allowed to mess with their skin to harm them because people want to use the hide, and so whatever you're doing to the hide is constructive and prohibited.
Let me ask you a question.
But okay.
Hold on 1 second.
Okay.
The next line in the Gemara, in the Mishnah, is going to contrast the 8 enumerated shratzim with different kinds of shratzim, which will have a different halacha. Dr. Stamler, I think you were first.
Yeah, so we may have touched it, or may have been answered already, so I apologize in advance if there was. What about a trapper? It's his profession, and he
We're
lays
not talking
trap.
about, you're talking about a snare?
Anything, snare, he's a trapper.
This was asked yesterday.
Okay, and he just leaves the traps out off the week, and I would assume.
Do me a favor. Let's not go there now. Right now we're going to read it innocently, that you're proactively be a dayim trapping it with a net or whatever, and the chovel is also that you are intentionally, or I should say directly, causing a wound. It's a good question. I don't want to say that's not a good question, but there's so many angles we can go, and I'm struggling already to stay focused. So,
Fine.
Doctor?
So the category I want to ask about is harming an animal. Harm.
Injuring.
Harming an animle.
Well, chovel here we're saying wounding them.
Oh, well, okay. Well,
Which is essentially the same.
I want to get to a point.
Okay.
The same, wounding or harming, hurting an animal. Do we consider, quote, non-physical harm, quote, psychological harm, trauma, which we do consider in other cases, removing a baby from its mother, animal, and stuff like that?
You're asking a very interesting question, an important question, but I just want to clarify what we're discussing here, that for some reason there's a prevailing practice among trappers to instill, this is an assumption, but I think it's a necessary assumption. We're talking about certain practices that hunters or trappers would do because somehow, for some reason, it was helpful or contributed to the quality, the value, or the processing of the hide. Now, certainly, senseless, useless, and we could debate. I mean, I think we agree, but in the Gemara's concept, we could debate what's considered senseless and useless. But we are certainly not advocating harming, and certainly not uselessly and needlessly harming an animal. And so, I don't even think psychological harm is something that we are saying that one should do. Recall, our discussion here is not ways that you should mitigate harm to animals. That is an important discussion. It's just not this discussion.
Okay.
Here we're talking about harm that is being inflicted. And it's considered the desecration of Shabbos if it's permitted. If it's prohibited, you're already in trouble, but it's not constructive. And so you should never be doing it. And so therefore it's not considered choivel, constructive harming on Shabbos, but it is generally not to be done. So here we're talking about a type of harming which for some reason may be part of the process that trappers would employ. It is constructive to the person, obviously not to the animal. And even so, and that being the case, it should not be done on Shabbos. That's essentially what we're discussing. But it is important to note that, yes, hurting animals, Sar Bali Chayim, psychologically giving distress to an animal is not something that the Torah condones. And on the contrary, we need to be mindful of the pain of animals. And on a very personal note, this is not something that I've seen in the Torah, although I'm sure the Torah supports. I think you can tell a lot about a person's character and how they treat humans, and I've said this before, by how they treat animals. So a person that is callous and cruel to animals, I wouldn't trust them as a babysitter for kids either. And so that's a little bit of my side commentary.
Rabbi, could I ask you just a question about trapping?
Yes.
It's been on my mind for a while. I wanted to bring it up yesterday, but most people in those days, most Jews in those days, had chickens, and the chickens were kept in a wired big cage or a wired area, so they couldn't get out. So they were trapped. So what happens on the Shabbos? Are they committing a sin for the Shabbos?
Sorry, I'm confused. Repeat that again. Chickens are trapped.
That's right.
So what? No.
So the act of trapping is
Hold
continued on
So
Shabbos.
let me give the definition again, because you're asking a question I think many of us are wondering. There is no prohibition to have an animal in containment. There's no prohibition to have an animal in a trap. We are prohibited on Shabbos from getting the animal into the trap. That's the prohibition. So again, the prohibition is not to have an animal in the trap, it's to put an animal in the trap. And as a matter of fact, that will help us understand yesterday's Gemara about the person sitting in the doorway, and then the second person sitting in the doorway and maintaining his status there. We said that's not a problem. Do you know why that's not a problem? Because that's like maintaining a chicken coop. That's not a problem. Going out into the wild, catching a wild rooster or chicken and putting it into a trap, that is prohibited. And that's why we keep on saying a domestic animal that's already in human, already owned by humans, well, that's trapped already, and you can't retrap it. So that's
Even
a
if
good question.
Even if the chicken gives birth on a Shabbos,
There are other issues that need to be
then the
considered,
baby
but
is
not
trapped.
the issue of trapping. Real fast, before we go on to see what happens to the non-enumerated shrutzim. Tosfos says, you know what's wrong with hurting these animals? Mishum netilas neshama iker. It's akin to shchita, to killing the animal. Why? Shalmer, you there? What? Someone's knocking on the door. Killing an animal is prohibited. Well, you know what? Hurting an animal is a fraction of killing. Killing an animal is draining the life vitality of the animal. To cut the animal, to hurt the animal, well, that's an installment of killing. That's a miniature killing, and that's also not allowed on Shabbos. Oh, okay. Oh, go run after. Yeah. And so that's what Tosfos says, and there we have it. All right, let's continue the Gemara. Any other questions about understanding here? All right, so fast. 8 shrotzim. You're not allowed to catch them. You're not allowed to trap them. You know why? Because people trap them. It's considered constructive, proactive, desirable, and you're not allowed to harm them. If you harm them, well, there are a few possibilities of what you're doing wrong, depending on which commentary you ask. Either you're causing pigment to the hide, which is prohibited, or Tosfos, and one opinion in Rashi, you harm the animal, it's a step towards death. It's a step towards killing. And that's not to be done on Shabbos. Now let's see line number 2 of the Mishnah. What about other kinds of crawling, creeping, gross animals that fall under the general sheretz title? Hachovel bahem. If a person hurts, wounds one of them, patur. One is exempt. Exempt for the laws of Shabbos. This is not advocating hurting animals. Again, if a person harms these animals on Shabbos, they are exempt. Why? So Rashi says, the ein lahem, or we do not consider their skin to be it's a very fine, thin skin. It is not thick. It is not converted into a usable material, and therefore there is no value or purpose to harming it. Therefore, what you're doing is not constructive. You might be potter. You certainly should not do it. Let me read from you. Alternatively, according to the way the other explanation of Rashi that has to do with dyeing, we would say thin skin doesn't become discolored the way thick skin does. Whereas the 8 shrotzim we talked about, they all have thick skin that is used commercially, and therefore there may be a desire to have pigment. So there's 2 kinds of shrotzim. There's 2 kinds of crawling animals. The kinds that are sanctioned in the Torah, the kinds that are not. The kinds that are sanctioned, you're not allowed to trap, you're not allowed to hurt. The kinds that are not mentioned in the Torah, if you harm them, you're potter. Hatsadon, and if you trap them, are you allowed to trap them? Litzoyrech, if you take it for a specific use, a specific need. Chayiv, you're chayiv, because you're not allowed to trap things if you need them, if there is a constructive purpose. Shaloi litzoyrech, but if you trap it aimlessly, uselessly, potter, one is exempt. Because the general species is not typically trapped, says Rashi. And this specific critter is not needed for anything. And so, although you shouldn't do it, and it's not permissible on Shabbos, this is not the act of trapping in a constructive manner. And as we always point out, the prohibited labor of Shabbos are all constructive, or meant to be constructive. Rashi, this is a malacha that's pointless. You're not accomplishing what you intend or need to do. And Rashi right away tells us something, and Mark, listen carefully. Well, if you remember from last night, Rabbi Shimon, this is the viewpoint of Rabbi Shimon, who says that a malacha that's done pointlessly, one is potter. It is plausible that the opinion that says that even a malacha which is not constructive, or is not being done for its constructive intended purpose, you're chayiv. It's possible that Rabbi Yehuda would say that you're still chayiv. Alan, the Mishnah now is going to address your question outright. An animal that's in your jurisdiction, you've already have it. It's already been trapped. Hatsodon, potter. If one traps it, they're potter because it's already trapped. You have not done an act of trapping. But if you hurt them, chayiv, you're not allowed to do so. Because the animals that you keep are most likely, as Rashi says, they have hide. There's something that you could do with their skin, and therefore being chovel, damaging it is prohibited. If I may say so, in a way, this is a rough Mishnah. It's got leaves us needing to do a lot of thinking. The hardest part of the Mishnah is we're making many assertions about 8 shratzim, but we still don't have a perfectly working definition of all of the 8 shratzim. So I want to acknowledge that might be something that's a little bit challenging for us. What the Gemara is now going to do is the Gemara is going to seek to identify the author of our Mishnah, who is the person that has the opinion espoused in our Mishnah, because, or rather based on other texts about the Shemona Shvatz. What I think we'll do is we'll get started today, and we'll try to close out tomorrow so we don't spend too much time spinning our wheels on this, but this is an important Gemara, and it has halachic implications down to the code of Jewish law. Midiktani, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Rabbi, isn't one of the problems geography? Because the kind of shrotzim that Rashi would see in Europe is very different from the geography of Babylon or Eretz Yisrael.
Well, I don't think that Rashi is talking per se about the critters that he himself saw in France, northern France. I think Rashi is conveying a tradition that he had about the identity of these animals. Is it likely that his perspective was at least somewhat influenced by the animals he saw? Absolutely. But I think the real problem here is that many of these, the biblical animals, or I'm sorry, let me back up. I like what you said, but I want to just take it a little differently. The Jews in the desert and in Eretz Yisrael probably knew the identity of most of these animals. 2 things happened. After the destruction of the first temple and the second temple, the actual topography and the survey of animals in the region shifted and changed. Alongside that, the Jews dispersed. And so likely they did not have ongoing constant exposure to these animals. And so although the Jews were always studying the Chumash and they were always giving translations, that's probably how we have multiple varying interpretations. Even more than that, it seems like based on the survey of the kinds of creatures that I mentioned, many of the sages agree about a specific animal being a sheretz. They're just not sure which Hebrew word applies to the mole and which Hebrew word applies to the lizard X. And so again, that would likely be a byproduct of the galut and the inability to immediately identify each of these creatures. Our Gemara, based on its discussion, is going to attempt to find or describe common features of these animals. And we've already essentially said that we think that the 8 shratzim mentioned all have a kind of thicker hide that has a commercial value or function that people would desire to trap the animal for its hide. And we're also mindful about what the hide looks like and its pigment. Also, because it's thicker, it's more impressionable and more capable of absorbing pigment. Let's see the Gemara. Midiktani. And the Gemara is going to make some assertions that we may already know from Rashi. Midiktani hachoyvel behem chayav. The Mishnah says that if you injure, you wound any of the 8 shratzim, you are chayiv for wounding them. Michlal, I infer from here. The is lehu, or I infer from here that these are creatures that have hide. What does it mean, hide? I believe we mean thicker skin. Mantana, is there a sage in the Mishnayos who's of the belief that all 8 shratzim have thick hide? If we could identify that person, we can identify the author of our Mishnah who asserts we think that they all have thick hide. And by the way, the person who we're looking for would be disagreeing with the Rabbanan, who have a different viewpoint on the status of the hide of these critters. So again, or we can infer that there was hide. Man Tana, who is the rabbi that says this? Amar Shmuel. Shmuel explains the opinion of our Mishnah is the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. The Tanan. Let's read a Mishnah. This is a Mishnah that I looked up, and it's in Tractate Chulin, I believe, like this. Yochanan ben Nuri Aimer Shmoyne Shratzim Yesh Lahem Ayres. There are the 8 enumerated crawling critters have hides. They have thicker hide that has a use. What's the point of this assertion here? Listen carefully. I know today's a little bit more of a confusing Gemara. We said that if an animal dies in a non-kosher way, it is an avela. Or a non-kosher animal dies. It conveys ritual impurity. There are certain parts of the animal, however, that do not convey ritual impurity. The parts, for example, horns or other kinds of cartilage-like parts do not convey ritual impurity. What about the skin? Does the skin convey ritual impurity? Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri asserts that it depends. Well, actually, no, halacha asserts it depends on how thick the skin is. If the skin is very thin, and pardon me for saying this, it's kind of edible. It's just like the animal itself. Well, then that hide has the same halacha as the flesh. But if it is very thick and tough and inedible, well, then it has the halacha that it does not convey ritual impurity. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is saying, Shmoyne Shratzim, the 8 sheritzes mentioned in the Torah, although they convey ritual impurity, their skins do not. So the words yesh lahem ayros means they have skins that are distinct and a part of the flesh. The Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Yochanan, and they say only 3 of those animals have skins, and the remainder of them, they say some of them the skin does convey ritual impurity, and some does not. Particularly the animals called Anaka, Koach, Lita'a, and Chomet. The Chachamim say they do convey ritual impurity. They do not have orot. So again, this is what I warned you or told you. We're comparing a survey of the halacha as it talks about ritual impurity to the laws of Shabbos. And Shmuel says, our Mishnah is the viewpoint of Rabbi Yochanan, who says all these animals have hide. The Chachamim disagree. And the Chachamim would argue with our Mishnah too. Rabba bar Rav Huna Amar Rav. So here we have a dissenting opinion, Rav's opinion, who says our Mishnah can apply to all of the rabbis of the Mishnah. Filu Teim Rabbanan. Even the rabbis who say certain animals have very thin hide, and therefore they convey ritual impurity. For the purposes of Shabbos, they would still say that they do have hide. Ad kan lepligi Rabbanan ale Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. The whole debate in the Mishnah that we're quoting here is in the context of Tumah, ritual impurity. The Eilat Meim Lachem. Rabbis or Sam Kivsarim to teach us that sometimes the flesh and the skin have the same halacha. But maybe on Shabbos, the rabbis would agree that you're not allowed to hurt any of these animals. Folks, I'm tempted to pause over here for now because I feel like today may have been an overwhelming Gemara, although we haven't covered a lot of ground. What do you say?
I say we could pause, but I hope by tomorrow you speak with the Rebbitzin and give us a list of shoes, pocketbooks, and belts that are acceptable and those that are not acceptable.
So actually, I'll tell you something funny. You know what our Gemara is asserting? If you can make a belt or a shoe, it's not tummy. If you can't make a belt or a shoe, it means that it's very thin hide. Well, then maybe it does convey ritual impurity. And you know what? There are certain animals or certain places on the animal where the skin is very thin and it really cannot be converted into hide. And that might be akin to the flesh. Now, again, I don't want to be graphic or anything, but this isn't too graphic. I think there are certain people and certain parts of certain animals that human beings consume. So, for example, although this is a matter of personal preference, a person can consume their chicken with skin on it.
Right.
I hope no one is thinking of eating their steak with hide on it. That's not going to taste very good.
Right.
And then I don't know if I can mention this because it's not kosher, but I've seen recipes or videos of people cooking pork belly, and they also consume the skin. And so the point is, some animals have hide that's just like the food, like the flesh. It's very thin, it's edible, it's soft. And then there are other kinds of critters that have very thick skin. And so our Mishnah says all 8 of those shrotzim, if you injure them, you're chayiv, which we think and we believe now that injuring is synonymous with having hide, having thicker skin. Question becomes, do these rabbis only accept the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who says that for the purposes of ritual impurity, the animal's skin does not convey ritual impurity because it is thick? Or maybe even the Chachamim of the Mishnah, who say there are 4 of these types of animals that have very thin skin, and therefore the skins are impure. He might agree that for the purposes of Shabbos, you are chayiv for all 8, even though for the purposes of eating or the purposes of ritual impurity, 4 of them don't have thick skin. And so we have 2 ways to understand our Mishnah. One that says that our Mishnah is exclusively the viewpoint of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and the other one that says that the viewpoint of the Mishnah is able to actually follow both Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Chachamim. We're going to stop here in the Gemara. I just want to let you know the next few lines, the Gemara is going to read carefully between the lines and try to identify if we can comfortably accept the assertion of Rav that all the rabbis of the Mishnah about impurity would agree with our Mishnah or not. It's a little bit of a back and forth. And then we move on to the next Gemara. But for now, we have our Mishnah, which draws a important halachic distinction between the 8 shrotzim that are mentioned in the Torah and the additional shrotzim that are not mentioned in the Torah. We took the opportunity to read a variety of definitions of the 8 shrotzim, realizing that there is not a perfect consensus on their identity. And then we sought to compare and contrast our Mishnah here about the laws of Shabbos with the Mishnah that talks about the laws of ritual impurity and the status of the hide. With Shmuel saying that our Mishnah only follows the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Rav saying even the Chachamim might agree over here that it is considered to have hide to be prohibited to do on Shabbos. That concludes today's Gemara. I want to thank you all for your endurance as we get started with a new parak. For the next few days, we'll be studying this chapter. Other topics, don't worry. And welcome to the world of Shmoina Shrotzim. Welcome to the world of creepy crawlies. And the professor told us, we'd call that world a vivarium. Right? All right. Very good. Friends, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day. Praying and hoping for good news, healthy news, happy news. And look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. Gesundheit and hate. If anyone's interested, tonight at 7 p.m., we have our 3rd installment of Jewish Learning Institute's Meditation from Sinai. And if you want to join, you're welcome to reach out, send me a message, and I'll send you a link, or you can come in person. Until then, have a wonderful day. Shkoyach all.
Shkoyach, thank you.
And if anyone wants to come to shul tomorrow morning, there's no tehillim.
You mean
There's
there's no tachnim?
No tachnim.